In the picturesque town of Pinewood, Pennsylvania, life had a rhythm as steady as the seasons. Nestled among rolling hills and thick woods, Pinewood was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The residents prided themselves on the town's sense of community, where everyone knew one another and neighbors were more like extended family. The town square, with its cobblestone streets and quaint shops, was the heart of this small world, where people gathered for coffee, exchanged pleasantries, and shared the latest gossip. It was a place where the past felt close, and change was a distant visitor. At the center of Pinewood's social fabric were the Millers. John and Ellen Miller were an established, well-respected couple who owned and operated Pinewood Inn, a charming bed and breakfast that had been in John's family for generations. The inn, with its ivy-covered stone walls and sprawling gardens, was a beloved landmark in Pinewood. Guests often returned year after year, drawn by the warmth and hospitality that John and Ellen offered. John, a tall man with a quiet strength, was known for his kindness and the meticulous care he put into maintaining the inn. Ellen, with her easy smile and nurturing spirit, was the perfect hostess, making each guest feel like part of the family. The Millers' life seemed as steady and serene as the town itself. Married for over 2 decades, they had built a life rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. Their marriage was one that others in Pinewood admired: solid, dependable, and seemingly unshakable. John had inherited the inn from his father, and together with Ellen, they had turned it into a thriving business. They hosted community events, supported local charities, and were always among the first to offer help when someone in town needed it. A year before, the Garfields had arrived in Pinewood, bringing with them a breath of fresh air and a hint of the outside world. Michael Garfield was a successful tech entrepreneur who had decided to leave the bustling city life behind in favor of the tranquility of a small town. He was tall and charismatic, with an easygoing charm that made him instantly likable. His wife, Sarah, was a warm and engaging woman, quick to smile and eager to become part of the community. With her dark hair and bright eyes, Sarah exuded a youthful energy that was contagious. The Garfields had purchased a sprawling old farmhouse on the edge of town and quickly set about renovating it, turning it into a modern sanctuary while preserving its historic charm. Despite their different backgrounds, the Millers and the Garfields quickly formed a close bond. It began at a local charity event, a fundraiser for the Pinewood Historical Society, where John and Michael found themselves standing together near the refreshments table. They struck up a conversation about the town's history, with John sharing stories of Pinewood's past and Michael expressing his appreciation for the town's charm. The conversation flowed easily, and it wasn't long before they discovered a shared passion for gardening. John, who tended to the inn's gardens with the same care he gave his guests, was delighted to find a kindred spirit in Michael, who had plans to transform the grounds of his new home into something special. Their friendship blossomed over the next few months. Michael would often stop by the inn to chat with John, exchanging tips on soil and plants or sharing a drink on the inn's porch, overlooking the gardens. These moments of camaraderie were a welcome escape from the pressures of running a business for both men. Ellen and Sarah, too, found common ground. They bonded over book club meetings and cooking classes at the local community center, where they would laugh together, sharing recipes and stories from their pasts. Ellen admired Sarah's enthusiasm and the way she had thrown herself into life in Pinewood. Sarah, in turn, appreciated Ellen's wisdom and the calm, steady presence she brought to their friendship. The two couples began to spend more time together, hosting dinners at each other's homes and attending town events as a foursome. Their friendship became a fixture in Pinewood, a symbol of the town's welcoming spirit and the deep connections that formed there. On the surface, it seemed like the beginning of a lifelong friendship between the two families. But beneath the surface, subtle tensions began to form, unnoticed at first. These were the small cracks that would eventually widen, leading to a chain of events that no one in Pinewood could have anticipated. For now, though, the Millers and the Garfields were content, their lives intertwined in the quiet town where nothing ever seemed to change. It was the calm before the storm. The summer of 2023 in Pinewood was sweltering, the heat clinging to the town like an unwelcome guest. The warmth, usually a source of comfort, now seemed oppressive, mirroring the growing tension within the Miller household. Ellen Miller, once the heart and soul of Pinewood Inn, had begun to change. Her usual cheerful demeanor faded, replaced by a quiet unease that did not go unnoticed by those around her. John Miller, who had always prided himself on knowing his wife better than anyone, couldn't ignore the shift in her behavior. It started with small things: a certain distance in her gaze, the way she hesitated before speaking, as if her thoughts were miles away. Ellen, who had always been the first to greet guests and chat with townsfolk, now often retreated to the sanctuary of her private study, a room once filled with warmth and creativity but now cloaked in a palpable tension. The books she used to love gathered dust on the shelves, and the once vibrant garden she tended so lovingly with John began to wilt under the summer sun. She became a shadow of her former self, avoiding eye contact and finding excuses to skip social gatherings. When friends asked her if everything was all right, she would force a smile, her eyes betraying the truth she wasn't ready to share. John was perplexed and worried, but he trusted Ellen implicitly. He chalked up her behavior to stress, maybe burnout from running the inn, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong. He tried to be patient, giving her space while attempting to bridge the growing distance between them. They still had their moments: quiet dinners on the porch, long walks through the garden, but even in these moments, Ellen seemed far away, lost in thoughts she couldn't or wouldn't share. The tension came to a head one stifling evening in late July. John had returned from a day of errands around town, the weight of the summer heat pressing down on him. He found Ellen in her study, the room dimly lit, with only the flickering light of her phone screen illuminating her face. She didn't notice him standing in the doorway at first, her focus entirely on the messages she was reading. Her expression was one of anguish, of conflict, emotions John hadn't seen on her face before. John's voice was soft but startled her nonetheless. She quickly fumbled with her phone, but not before he caught a glimpse of the screen: a message from Michael Garfield. The words he saw in that brief moment, "I miss you and when can we meet," were enough to send a jolt of dread through him. "What's going on?" John asked, his voice tight with a mix of fear and anger. Ellen, usually composed, looked like a deer caught in headlights. She tried to brush it off, but the guilt in her eyes was impossible to hide. John's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped closer, demanding to see the phone. Ellen hesitated, but she knew there was no way out. With trembling hands, she handed it to him. As John scrolled through the messages, his worst fears were confirmed. The words were undeniable, intimate, secretive, and filled with a longing that had no place between Ellen and Michael. Every message felt like a stab to the heart, each one more painful than the last. His vision blurred with anger and betrayal as he tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The man he considered a friend, who had shared countless meals and conversations with him, had been carrying on an affair with his wife. The room seemed to spin as the reality set in. "Ellen, what the hell is this?" John's voice trembled with rage, the phone shaking in his hand. Ellen's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks as she realized there was no way to explain this away, no way to take back what had been done. "I'm so sorry, John," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It just did." John's world shattered in that moment. The woman he had loved for over 20 years, the woman he had shared his life with, had betrayed him in the worst way possible. "You betrayed me, Ellen," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Our whole life together, and with my friend, no less." Ellen tried to explain, but the words caught in her throat. How could she justify what she had done? She couldn't. All she could do was cry, each tear a reflection of the pain she had caused. She wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that she still loved him, that she never wanted to hurt him, but she knew it would be meaningless now. John stormed out of the house, his mind reeling. He needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating betrayal he felt. He drove aimlessly through the town. The streets that once felt so familiar now seemed alien. His thoughts were a chaotic whirl. How long had this been going on? How could he have been so blind? And most of all, what was he supposed to do now? The next day, still grappling with his emotions, John confronted Michael. He drove to the Garfield's farmhouse, anger simmering just beneath the surface. Michael met him at the door, his expression a mix of guilt and defensiveness. He knew why John was there. "John," Michael started, but John cut him off. "How could you do this, Michael? You were supposed to be my friend," John spat, his voice trembling with rage. Michael tried to deflect the blame, his own guilt and fear making him desperate. "I never wanted to hurt anyone, John. It just happened. We were both lost. Ellen and we were seeking something we couldn't find in our own lives." John's fists clenched at his sides, his whole body shaking with the effort to contain his fury. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You ruined everything." The confrontation left both men seething, but there was no resolution to be found. Michael retreated into the house, while John drove away, his anger now mixed with a deep, aching sadness. The friendship that had once brought him so much joy had been irreparably damaged, replaced by a bitterness that hung heavy in the air. Meanwhile, Sarah Garfield, who had been blissfully unaware of the affair, began to notice the tension in her own home. Michael had grown distant, and their once easygoing relationship was strained. Sarah's attempts to reach out were met with vague excuses and a coldness she couldn't understand. She had always trusted Michael, believed in the life they were building together in Pinewood, but now doubts crept into her mind, gnawing at her peace. The truth finally came to light one evening when Sarah overheard a heated conversation between Michael and John on the phone. She pieced together enough of their words to realize something was terribly wrong. Confronting Michael, Sarah demanded to know what was going on. At first, Michael tried to brush it off, but under Sarah's intense questioning, he broke down and confessed. The shock on Sarah's face was profound. Her world crumbled around her as the reality of the situation set in. "How could you, Michael? How could you do this to us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael's attempts to explain only made things worse. The man she thought she knew had been lying to her, betraying her with someone she had come to consider a friend. The betrayal cut deep, and Sarah struggled to reconcile the loving husband she thought she had with the man standing before her. As the news of the affair spread through Pinewood, the scandal became the talk of the town. Whispers followed the Millers and the Garfields wherever they went. People who once greeted them with warm smiles now offered only cold stares and hushed conversations. The once close-knit community began to splinter, with loyalties divided and rumors running rampant. The affair had not only destroyed 2 marriages but also fractured the very fabric of Pinewood itself. The relationships that had seemed so strong were now shattered, leaving behind a trail of broken trust and bitter resentment. The Millers and the Garfields were now living in a small-town nightmare, one from which there seemed to be no escape. As summer faded into fall, the leaves in Pinewood turned vibrant shades of red and gold, masking the darkness that had taken root in Ellen Miller's life. The affair with Michael Garfield had started as a fleeting escape, a dangerous thrill that filled a void she couldn't name. But as the weeks wore on, the weight of her betrayal became unbearable. Each moment spent with Michael was tainted by the knowledge of the deceit they were both perpetuating. Ellen couldn't look at her husband John without feeling a gnawing sense of guilt, a relentless voice in her head reminding her of the vows she had broken. Michael, however, seemed to thrive on the secrecy. The affair had awakened something in him, an obsession, a hunger for control. As his paranoia grew, so did his possessiveness. He became convinced that John was onto them, that every glance or question from John was laced with suspicion. Michael's once charming demeanor took on a darker edge, and Ellen found herself increasingly fearful of the man she had once been drawn to. She knew they were spiraling, but she felt powerless to stop it. One evening, under the guise of a routine business trip, Michael lured Ellen to a secluded cabin on the outskirts of town. It was a place they had used before, a hidden sanctuary where they could be alone, away from prying eyes. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The air inside the cabin was thick with tension, the silence between them almost suffocating. Michael poured them both a drink, his hand steady as he handed Ellen a glass. She took it reluctantly, feeling the coldness of the glass mirror the chill in her heart. As they sat across from each other, the flickering fire casting shadows on the walls, Michael finally spoke. "We can't keep going like this, Ellen," he said, his voice low and intense. "John's going to find out sooner or later. And when he does, it'll be over for us. You know that, don't you?" Ellen looked down at her drink, the liquid inside rippling slightly from the trembling of her hands. "What are you saying, Michael?" she asked, though she already knew. The dread that had been growing inside her now threatened to overwhelm her. Michael leaned in closer, his eyes boring into hers. "We could end this, Ellen. We could get rid of John. It would be easy," he whispered, his voice calm and measured, as if he were discussing a simple business transaction. Ellen recoiled, the blood draining from her face. "You're insane, Michael. I won't be a part of this," she shouted, her voice breaking with fear and disgust. The idea of harming John, of killing the man she had once loved, was unthinkable. She stood up, ready to flee the cabin, but Michael grabbed her wrist, pulling her back down. "Ellen, listen to me," he hissed, his grip tightening. "If John finds out, we're done. He'll ruin both of us. Our lives, our reputations, everything will be destroyed. But if he's gone, we could be free. We could be together, without fear." Ellen's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. The rational part of her screamed to run, to leave Michael, and never look back. But another part of her, the part that was terrified of losing everything, hesitated. Michael's words were insidious, planting seeds of doubt and fear that took root in her already fragile state. Over the next few weeks, Michael's manipulation intensified. He became more relentless, preying on Ellen's vulnerabilities, twisting her fear into a weapon against her. "He knows," Ellen, Michael would say, his voice dripping with certainty. "I saw the way he looked at us at that dinner. He's just waiting for the right moment to confront us. And when he does, it'll be too late." Ellen, emotionally exhausted and terrified of what the future might hold, began to believe him. The thought of John discovering the affair filled her with dread, not just because of the shame, but because of the consequences. What would happen to the inn? To her life in Pinewood? The fear of losing everything, coupled with Michael's relentless pressure, pushed her to the brink. Finally, she gave in. The plan was gruesomely simple. Michael knew that John had a habit of taking late-night drives, a way to unwind after a long day of managing the inn. It was on these drives that he would clear his head, the quiet of the night a balm to the stresses of the day. Michael proposed they stage an accident on one of these drives. A remote, winding road just outside of town, a road with steep drops and sharp turns, was the perfect location. All it would take was a small tampering with John's car, a malfunction in the brakes, and the accident would appear tragically inevitable. Michael, with his background in technology, assured Ellen that he could handle the technical aspects. He would disable the car's brake system, making sure it failed at just the right moment. Ellen's role would be to keep John in the dark, to act as if nothing was amiss, and to provide an alibi if needed. The plan was set for a cold November night, when the roads would be slick with rain and the visibility poor. As the day approached, Ellen's anxiety grew unbearable. She found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep, haunted by the knowledge of what she was about to do. Yet she was too deep into the plan to back out. Every time she thought of confessing, of telling John the truth, Michael's words echoed in her mind, "He'll destroy us both." She was trapped, caught between her guilt and her fear, spiraling deeper into the web of lies they had woven. On the night of the plan, Ellen watched in a daze as John prepared to leave for his drive. He was oblivious to the storm brewing around him, humming softly as he grabbed his keys and jacket. Ellen stood by the door, her hands clenched into fists to stop them from shaking. "Drive safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John turned to her, his warm smile a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. "I always do, Ellen." "I'll be back soon," he replied, leaning in to kiss her on the cheek. The gesture, so familiar and comforting, nearly broke her resolve, but she forced herself to stay composed, to play the part she had been assigned. As John's car disappeared into the night, Ellen felt a hollow emptiness settle in her chest. She went to the kitchen, unable to sit still, and started scrubbing the counters, washing dishes that were already clean, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from racing. Every tick of the clock echoed in her ears, each passing minute bringing her closer to the moment of truth. Meanwhile, John drove down the winding road, the night shrouded in darkness. The rain had started to fall, light at first, but gradually picking up in intensity. He turned on the windshield wipers, the rhythmic swish of the blades almost hypnotic, but something felt off. The car, usually so responsive, seemed sluggish. He pressed the brakes as he approached a sharp turn, but nothing happened. Panic surged through him as he realized the brakes weren't working. He pressed down harder, but the pedal went straight to the floor. Instincts kicked in, and John gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to control the car as it careened around the bend. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought to keep the vehicle on the road, the tires skidding on the slick asphalt. Despite the malfunction, John's years of driving experience served him well. He managed to regain enough control to avoid a deadly plunge off the side of the road. His mind raced as he pulled the car to a stop on a flat stretch of road, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a random malfunction. The brakes had been fine earlier that day. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This had been no accident. Someone had tampered with his car. His thoughts immediately turned to Ellen. The strange behavior, the tension, the distance, everything suddenly made sense. He didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were falling into place. Whoever had done this had intended for him to die that night. With a cold clarity, John made a decision. Instead of heading home, he turned the car around and drove straight to the police station, his mind already working through what needed to be done. Whatever was going on, he would get to the bottom of it. And when he did, those responsible would pay. The morning after the accident that wasn't, Pinewood woke up to an eerie calm. The November air was crisp, with a light frost covering the ground, but beneath the town's surface, tension was brewing. John Miller, who should have been dead, sat at his kitchen table, the remnants of a sleepless night etched into his face. He had spent hours replaying the events in his mind, trying to reconcile the loving wife he thought he knew with the horrifying truth he now faced. Ellen had tried to kill him. And worse, she hadn't acted alone. Michael, the man he considered a friend, was the orchestrator. John's first move was to contact the police, but he knew better than to walk in without solid evidence. He needed to prove that what happened wasn't just an unfortunate malfunction, but a deliberate attempt on his life. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of an old college friend, Sam, who had transitioned from being a private investigator in New York to working quietly in small towns like Pinewood. Sam had seen it all, from cheating spouses to corporate espionage, but nothing like this. "Sam, I need your help." John's voice trembled slightly as he explained what had happened. Sam didn't hesitate. "I'll be there by noon," he said, his voice steady, the sound of someone who knew exactly what to do. While waiting, John went through the motions of his morning routine, making coffee, checking the inn's bookings, but his mind was elsewhere. He had to maintain a facade, at least until Sam arrived. Ellen was still asleep upstairs, unaware that her husband had outmaneuvered death the previous night. John couldn't bring himself to face her. Not yet. Sam arrived as promised, a tall, sharp-eyed man with a weathered face that bore the marks of years spent uncovering other people's secrets. He listened intently as John recounted the events, his face growing more serious with every word. "This isn't just about the affair," Sam said finally. "They've crossed a line. We need to get proof, something that the police can't ignore." They started by inspecting John's car, which was still parked in front of the inn. Sam's background in forensics proved invaluable as he carefully examined the brake system. "Look here," Sam said, pointing to a small device hidden near the brake lines. "This isn't something you find in an average car. It's been tampered with deliberately, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing." With the evidence mounting, Sam suggested they dig deeper. "We need to find out how far this goes. If Michael is behind this, there's bound to be a trail. People like him always leave something behind." They agreed that the next step was to investigate Michael, and Sam immediately began looking into his digital footprint. Using skills honed over decades, Sam hacked into Michael's email accounts, searching for anything that might tie him to the crime. What he found was beyond what even John had feared. The emails were encrypted, but Sam managed to break through the layers of security. He discovered a series of messages between Michael and Ellen, discussing their affair in detail, but also plotting John's death. In one email sent just a week before the planned accident, Michael wrote, "This needs to look natural, Ellen. We can't afford any mistakes. I'll take care of the car. All you need to do is keep him from getting suspicious." The last email, sent just hours before John's drive, was chilling in its cold calculation. "Tonight's the night. We'll finally be free, Ellen." Armed with this damning evidence, John and Sam went to the police. Detective Sarah Jacobs, a seasoned officer with a reputation for being both thorough and unyielding, took over the case. She listened carefully as John and Sam laid out everything they had found, her face growing darker with every revelation. "This isn't just attempted murder. It's premeditated, and we have more than enough to make arrests," she said, her voice hard. The next morning, Pinewood woke to a different kind of frost, one of scandal and shock. The police moved swiftly, arresting Ellen and Michael before the town had a chance to even grasp what had happened. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as the police led Ellen, pale and trembling, out of her home in handcuffs. Michael was taken in soon after, his arrogance quickly fading as he realized the extent of the evidence against him. The trial was the talk of Pinewood, a dark shadow over the once quiet town. In court, Ellen broke down almost immediately. Her once carefully maintained composure shattered as she confessed to everything. "I never wanted to hurt him," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "Michael convinced me. He said it was the only way. I was scared, and I believed him." Her confession, raw and filled with regret, painted a picture of a woman driven by fear and manipulation, but it did little to sway the jury. The evidence was irrefutable. Michael, on the other hand, remained cold and defiant, denying his involvement despite the mountain of proof against him. "She's lying," he shouted in the courtroom, his voice desperate. "I was only trying to protect us. She was the one who wanted him gone." But the jury saw through his lies. The emails, the tampering of the car, the entire plot, they all pointed to Michael as the mastermind. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all charges. The judge, stern and unforgiving, handed down the harshest sentence possible: life in prison without the possibility of parole for both Ellen and Michael. As the gavel fell, a heavy silence settled over the courtroom. The reality of their actions and the lives they had destroyed was undeniable. John sat quietly, the weight of the betrayal still fresh, but a sense of closure beginning to settle in. He had survived, but at a cost. The town he had loved, the life he had built, it was all gone, tainted by the darkness that had been hiding beneath the surface. After the trial, John wasted no time in leaving Pinewood. He sold the bed and breakfast, packed his belongings, and disappeared without a word. Some say he moved to a small town in the mountains, far from the memories of what had happened. Others believe he went abroad, trying to find solace in a new beginning. But wherever he went, Pinewood would never see him again. The town itself was never the same. The story of Ellen, Michael, and John became a cautionary tale, whispered among neighbors, told to newcomers as a warning of how easily love can turn into something dark and destructive. The bed and breakfast was eventually bought by a new couple, but it never regained its former charm. The town moved on, but the memory of what happened lingered, a permanent scar on the fabric of the community. And so Pinewood, once a beacon of peace and tranquility, became known as the town where love, jealousy, and fear had collided with deadly consequences, forever changing the lives of those who called it home.